Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Every cup of Nespresso coffee is an invitation to transform your morning routine into a ritual you can treasure each and every day. Using the Virtuo Pup, a simple touch of the button freshly brews bold aromas and a rich, velvety crema layer for delicious cafe-quality coffee at home. Whether you enjoy your coffee hot or over ice, every sip, every morning is unforgettable. Nothing tastes like Nespresso coffee. Visit Nespresso.com or our app to explore our full range of easy-to-use machines and coffees not found anywhere else.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Immigrantly. I am your host, Sadia Khan. I hope all of you are well, taking care of yourselves, paying attention to what's going on around us, keeping yourselves informed, and taking action in whatever way it manifests. Remember, I'm here with you, doing all of that and keeping all of you in my thoughts as we create more content. Talking about content, I love a good story, especially one that blends mystery, history, and a touch of serendipity. Today we have a guest who has done just that. Jake Warren is the founder of Message Heard podcast production company. Their tagline, Podcasts with Purpose. Jake is also the creative force behind Finding Natasha, a podcast that unravels a deeply personal family story. In the early 1970s, Jake's mother, Debbie Gale, was a promising young British ballerina who traveled to the Soviet Union to train at the prestigious Kirov Ballet. Her dream opportunity took a dark turn, leading to a life-saving encounter with a young Russian woman named Natasha. Decades later, Jake embarked on a journey to find this mysterious woman who had such a profound impact on his mother's life.
What I'm about to tell you is a story about the Soviet Union, the Cold War, ballet, and my mum. Now, my mum, Debbie, is from London, and growing up, she was good at ballet. I mean, really good. But to be the best, you have to dance with the best. And the undisputed masters of ballet were, and are, in Russia.
This quest was a personal journey into his family's past, uncovering themes of love, faith, and the enduring human spirit. Today, I turn the mic to Jake to explore what it is like to delve into his mother's history, the challenges of retracing decades-old steps, and how this journey has shaped his understanding of family and destiny. By the way, they have another podcast out called Finding Andy, which is part of the same series, and I can't wait to check it out. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Welcome to Immigrantly, Jake. I am so excited to be sitting down with you virtually, of course. Where are you based?
I'm in London, South London right now in the UK.
So, when I think of London, I feel like after New York and Lahore, if there's a third city that I could see myself living, it would be London. I went there last year and it just looks like mini New York, but more diverse, which is crazy, right? New York is very diverse, but London is even more diverse.
It is. And I don't want to talk London down, right? Because I do love London. I was born here. I was raised here. I'm a true Londoner. But you do have to be happy with awful weather, grey skies, sleeting rain. Everyone's rude. No one would dare speak to each other. So there are many positives, but let's not also forget some of the colder negatives.
Yeah. I think as far as being rude, I live in New York, Jake. So I think that's something that I'm so used to. And then I grew up in Lahore, where people are extremely blunt. I wouldn't say they're rude, they're just the way they are.
Well, you should be fine then. Come on over. You've had good training.
Yeah, you're right. So I discovered Finding Natasha recently. When was the podcast launched?
Finding Natasha originally came out, I believe, in 2021, 2022, something like that.
I don't know how I missed it because I am a huge podcast listener, consumer, but I recently found it and I could not stop listening. I think I binge listened to all the episodes, maybe in a day. What's fascinating about the story is it's a very simple human story. The way that story comes together is so fascinating because as I was listening to episode 1, and I don't remember if it was at the end of episode 1 or beginning of episode 2 when you revealed that
Good,
you
thank
found
you.
Natasha.
So it sounds like you have uncovered exciting information.
I have found something that is true. So I found Natasha.
So it turns out finding Natasha wasn't as difficult as my mum thought it would be.
I think she lives in St. Petersburg still, and probably by the same address.
At least not when you're a professional people finder, have access to the internet, and are actually able to use it, unlike my mum.
What I did is I checked.
I was like, okay, so what are the next few episodes about? I will pause here. And for listeners, I want you to tell us what the story is about and how personal is it for you?
Yeah. And on that as well, where we kind of revealed in episode 2 or 3 or whatever it is that we'd found her, we kind of had a stark choice, right? Which was, do we pretend that we haven't found her and be dishonest and do, I'm sure, what lots of people do, which is lots of twists and turns and lots of dead ends? Or do we just own up to the fact that, look, we used the real specialist people finder. She was very good at her job, Olga, and she found her really quickly. And maybe that was a little bit embarrassing, but at the same time, let's not construct a narrative that's not true. Let's just lean into the fact that we worked with someone amazing who found her immediately. I'm glad that we did that, actually, because it was honest. But for the story as a whole, it's a strange one because, in my professional career, obviously, being a storyteller and a journalist across many different mediums, I've never had to do anything so deeply personal before. And that is a real blurring of the lines between the professional and the personal, right? So it's probably the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most rewarding because it's my mum's story. And broadly, the story, without giving away too many spoilers, because obviously I'd love for people to go and listen to it, is my mum, when she was a young girl, was told growing up in the UK, you could be the world's best ballet dancer. And this was during the early 70s. And she became the first Westerner to get a scholarship to dance in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and in what was then Leningrad, to go to the very prestigious Kirov School of Ballet. And, Russia still to this day, right, is where if you want to be the best of the best when it comes to ballet, that's where you kind of have to be. And she went there as a sort of young, naive, I think probably is the right word, 17-year-old, not really understanding what communism was or growing up behind the Iron Curtain and what it would like to be a Westerner living amongst that. And ultimately got very, very sick there, was sort of ignored, sort of left to her own devices. I think people feared her, right? As due to propaganda reasons, probably did fear a Westerner. And she unfortunately got very, very ill from drinking dirty water and contracted what we now know as hepatitis. And she was basically left in an isolation ward to die, got down to about 6 stone in weight. And basically the person that saved her life was the only person that showed her any kindness, was a young girl also at the ballet academy called Natasha, who just treated my mum with kindness. They barely could communicate. You know, my mum had but a few words of Russian and Natasha had but a few words of English, but she showed her kindness. And basically Natasha, at great personal risk, broke into this facility, got my mum out of this hospital, alerted the British consulate and saved my mum's life, got her out of the country. And the last time my mum saw her was on this runway in Russia 50 years ago, and had always wondered what had happened to her. You know, she views her as a guardian angel. I was very much supposed to be born a dainty ballerina who would be called Natasha, which sadly didn't transpire. And my mum, I think, came back and not only had to deal with the physical ailments, but also the mental of really, I think she, you know, her dream died there, although she didn't, thankfully. And she kind of internalized it. And I think through this sort of very professionalized mindset of to be the best is what it's all about and mediocrity or failure shouldn't be tolerated, she kind of repressed it, I think. And actually it was probably a few years before the show came out, I only really learned about it then when sadly my mum was diagnosed with cancer, and glad to say she survived and is fine and in remission now. Where one day, I think when perhaps she was feeling a little bit wistful and perhaps maybe unsure of her future, she kind of spilled her guts and told me the story. And I made a mental note that, okay, I'm a storyteller, I'm a journalist. This is an amazing story. I'd love to be able to try and find her, not even necessarily to try and take my mum's trauma and turn it into entertainment, because that's not what I was trying to do. But, you know, to use some of the tools at my disposal to see if I could find this woman, or at least find out what happened to her. And that's the journey of finding Natasha. It's, can I reunite my mum with the woman that saved her life 50 years ago, you know, half a lifetime ago, half a world away. All I had was a name and a partial address and an old, you know, black and white photograph, right? That's literally all I had. And I'll stop there because I don't want to spoil it.
And we see that in your conversations with your mom on the podcast. And as I was listening to it, I could see how your mom perceived Natasha and how important that person was in her life. But for you, Jake, growing up, were there any remnants of this story that you remember? And after your mother told you the story, as a kid, looking at your parent through that lens, how did you perceive Natasha and what were your expectations as you embarked on this journey of finding her?
When I was a kid, the honest answer was you're sort of oblivious to the fact that your parents have actually had lives and done interesting things, and you view them as just your mother or your father or whatever, and you kind of almost are slightly uninterested in what amazing things they may have done in their lives. And then you get to an age where actually you think, oh, actually my parents, maybe they are quite interesting and they've done interesting things. Natasha was sort of a bit of a peripheral figure, really, where there was sort of a grainy photo of someone on the mantelpiece that I didn't really know who this woman was. And she kind of stuck out amongst the sea of familial faces. And I knew my mum was, you know, an amazing ballet dancer and had danced professionally. And I knew on some level that she had been to Russia and, you know, had become very ill and that there was a sort of tragedy involved, which kind of ended her professional career, really. But I didn't really know the details. And when I was quite young, if I'm being honest, I didn't really bother to investigate. I didn't really because it was also something, I think, where in my family there was, especially on, well, both sides of my family, but on my mother's side of the family, there was a big culture of you don't talk about traumatic or negative things for a whole set of reasons. But it was sort of, there's an English expression, I don't know if it makes any sense to you, but kind of better to let sleeping dogs lie, which is a very British expression, that idea of, you don't disturb what doesn't need to be disturbed because the negative consequences or fallout from it might not be worth it. And I think even on some subconscious level, if I look back at my mom and my grandfather, who was the only survivor of the Holocaust in my family, and you didn't talk to him about his family, it's completely repressed, and he never spoke about it. There was very much a culture of you don't prod and poke and you don't ask difficult questions because it's not nice to upset anyone. There wasn't a sort of transparency or a problem shared as a problem half. That wasn't a mindset that was around really, and things are changing now, thankfully, for the better. But I certainly felt that as being 2 generations deep into it at that.
PSA for anyone who rents. If you haven't heard of Built, you are about to thank me. Earning points on rent is now a reality when you pay your rent through Built. You don't even have to check with your landlord to start earning points that you can use toward flights, hotel stays, fitness classes, and even your next rent payment. Let me break it down for you. There's no cost to join Built, and as a member, you'll earn valuable points on rent and on your everyday spending. Built points can be transferred to your favorite hotels and airlines, and even the ones you haven't heard of. There are over 500 airlines and 700,000 hotels and properties around the world you can redeem your Built points toward. Points can also be redeemed towards a future rent payment and unique experiences that only Built members can access. How incredible is that? So, if you're not earning points on rent, my question is, why not? Start earning points on rent you're already paying by going to joinbuilt.com/immigrantly. That's joinbilt.com/immigrantly. Make sure to use our URL so they know we sent you. Joinbuilt.com/immigrantly to start earning points on your rent payments today.
Lowe's knows that free is just better. That's why MyLowe's Rewards is free to join. As a member, you earn points towards MyLowe's money on eligible purchases, get exclusive free gifts, and earn free shipping at Silver Key status, all on top of weekly member-only deals. Don't wait. Join MyLowe's Rewards for free today and start saving more. Lowe's, we help, you save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
Point.
Once you heard about the story from your mom, what were your expectations? What was the visual picture of Natasha that you drew in your mind, if any at all?
I mean, the expectations were low because I don't speak Russian. I had a name and a photograph, right? And this happened 50 years ago. One of the reasons why I kept my mum in the dark about what I was trying to do for so long was because I didn't want to open this can of worms and then ultimately have to turn around to her and say, I didn't find her, or I don't know what happened. And, you've kind of opened an old wound with no resolution and no way of healing it. So my expectations were low, but I knew that I could, again, an old adage, a truism, but I do think it is true, is, it's better to have tried and failed than to have never tried at all. And when my mum did kind of open up and tell me her story when she was unwell, a light bulb went off in my head where I have to at least try for my mum's sake. So I never thought that I would find her, let alone what even happened to her. But I knew for my own sake, but also for my mum's, I had to at least try.
And you indeed tried and you succeeded.
Yes, I did.
Fairly quickly. As I was listening to this story, I hear your mom talk about Natasha in such a respectful, almost sacrosanct manner. She sees this person as her hero, as somebody that she worships. And I was thinking if there were any cultural nuances at play in how your mom viewed Natasha. For instance, your mom's insistence on seeing Natasha in a particular light, while for Natasha, it may just have been a moment of helping someone in need. You mentioned how people in Soviet Union may have seen Westerners as enemies. So there were a lot of other external factors at play. Was that something that you discovered as the story unraveled?
Yeah, I mean, the first part of that question, I think about how my mum perceives Natasha as this sort of holier than thou figure, right? Like purity personified, like literally a guardian angel is kind of the language that she uses.
And she uses that word a lot.
Yeah, she does, because I think you've nailed it on the head. I think it's kind of like that two-way mirror of something where memory and perception of a same event experienced by two different people is a really interesting way of looking at something. So for my mum, who, is now a frightened 17-year-old in a country that are scared of her or hates her, and she doesn't speak the language.
She thinks they hate her.
Exactly. And it's probably more fear than hatred, right? She's a 17-year-old girl. It's not like she was, some spy or something. Just the innocent act of everyday kindness had huge implications for my mum. It didn't have huge implications for Natasha. It just showed that she was a good and decent human being. And, a tiny act of kindness that you may not think twice about. It goes to show that, there can be ripple effects of that. And what was very small and minor to Natasha felt very major to my mum. And that's interesting because I think there's a deference there, right? Natasha, I think, is a year, 18 months older than my mum. It's kind of like a big sister sort of thing, an element of sort of protectiveness and a maternal, I'll look after you and make sure you're okay. And even now, all these years later, there still is that bond. When we had the opportunity to reunite in real life, you could see that they went back to sort of being teenagers again, even though it had been 50 years with the same relationship. So yeah, it's very interesting that it probably wasn't a huge major thing in Natasha's life, but still it was one that had meaning because they're very close. And I think that's quite a beautiful thing in a way, because again, that sort of expression of never meet your heroes. Well, if you might have a hero that you idolize and you've not heard from or thought about properly for 50 years, and they can still be just as good and decent and kind as you remember them to be.
After researching your mother's experience in the Soviet Union, was there something unexpected you learned about life behind the Iron Curtain?
I think one thing that was really interesting is one of the things that they initially bonded over, my mum and Natasha, was a shared schoolgirl crush on Mikhail Baryshnikov, right? The great ballet dancer who managed to defect and escape to the West and was in such shows like Sex and the City, right? That's how a lot of people know him, rather than being the great ballet dancer. And I think one of the things that probably made my mum's life harder was she arrived in the Soviet Union, I think literally a month or so after he had defected. So again, you've got this big superstar, in effect, for want of a better term, who's run away to, inverted commas, the enemy. And so be wary of Westerners. And one thing that my mum said that, as a naive 17-year-old that she witnessed firsthand was Baryshnikov left behind his mother and his family and stuff, and that soldiers very publicly took his dogs and executed them, shot them in front of everyone as a kind of sort of not too subtle reminder that, you know, this is what happens to traitors, right? This is what happens to people that run away. And I think my mum, as a sort of naive teenager, not understanding communism or what it's like to live in a totalitarian state, she viewed this as this awful, immoral, how can this be allowed to happen? You know, this is evil, you know, horrible people that would do such a thing. Whereas I think perhaps the people who were hardened to it were kind of thinking, well, better the dogs than your family.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that was a very hard thing to suddenly come to terms with if you've been transported from, by comparison, a life of luxury in the West to suddenly being in the East. And it's a different set of rules and a different set of realities that govern people's existence. And that was very interesting because I think possibly the Baryshnikov defection indirectly had consequences to my mum and her time in Russia in terms of how people perceived and viewed her.
I like when you talk about perception, Jake, because I feel a lot of times how we view people, countries, societies in general is a product of perception rather than our own experiences. And unfortunately, your mom had a bad experience in then Soviet Union. But as a storyteller, and I'm pivoting a bit, moving towards your storytelling and production, how do you suspend those biases in order to tell a more authentic story, especially in this case when people do have a perception of what the Soviet Union was and what Russia is today?
It's a good question. And it doesn't just apply to this story, but to any story and any place in the world. A big thing for me is nuance. To many people, nuance is a nuisance, right? But actually, I think it's vital. And one of the biggest nuances I think you have to be able to do when you look at any place, any people, any culture, any country, is to discern a difference between the state or the government or the ruling class and the people, because nobody chooses where they are born and where they are grown up and the circumstances of which they are raised. You know, that is the lottery of life. And ultimately, you should never view an entirety of a culture or a people through the prism of what the people that rule that country or culture or state do, because often people are living in the best way that they can, right? Through self-preservation in order to literally survive, them and their family, rather than being malevolent or evil, right? And so for me, I've been lucky enough to travel all around the world to many places which are unusual. You know, I've been to North Korea a few times. I've been to parts of the Middle East and to Africa, which most people in the West wouldn't usually go or want to go. And I think it's also about having a willingness to try and understand people's perspective that isn't just through your own. And everyone grows up with a set of, I don't want to say indoctrinated because that's the wrong word, but you know, you are through osmosis, you learn a particular view of the world just because of the habit of the environment of what is the prevailing narrative of the culture or the country that you come from. And I think you have to be able to suspend belief in that in order to try and experience it from someone else's viewpoint and experience. You know, so it's kind of like lived experience is really valuable. And to try and get a sense or a taste of someone else's lived experience will often help you get a more well-rounded picture. The kind of thing that I always think about, and maybe I just say this because I'm not clever enough, is, you know, you can, especially in today's world of the internet, you can have as much knowledge as possible. You can consume knowledge constantly so that you're the most informed person ever. Right? It's a chore to be informed. You can do all the reading. You know, you can sit in your room all day and become the most informed person in the world. But I think if you want to understand, then often that has to be experiential. There's a taste, a touch, a smell, a feeling that comes from actually spending time with people.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. That's how you get to know people, cultures, lived experiences of others, right? And parts of it do play out in your story, especially from Natasha's perspective versus your mom's perspective. It's a very interesting interplay of how we view same incidents from different perspectives, especially in the context of where we are in life and how we grew up and what we experienced. Now that it's been 4 years since this podcast came out, has there been a shift in how your mom sees her story now versus how she saw it a few years ago?
It's a good question. I think yes is the answer. I think that the biggest thing for me to witness is a shift in how my mum viewed that story as a totally negative story, right? It was basically a story of failure. And so therefore she viewed herself as a failure because she had these ridiculous standards by which she dreamed of, I'm going to be the world's best ballet dancer and I'm going to go to Russia and I'm going to become the first English prima ballerina, at the Bolshoi or the Kirov, and all of these lofty dreams and ambitions, which, I greatly respect anyone that has the ambitions to be the greatest at whatever they do. But the fact that she didn't become that and effectively failed in her dream, even though, think about what was conspiring against her, right? And the fact she even got to the Soviet Union as a young Westerner is remarkable in of itself. The fact that she was mistrusted, the fact she was incredibly ill and almost died, but she couldn't shift this mindset of, I had a dream and I failed in my dream and therefore I am a failure. Whereas actually, I think this story, being able to reconnect with Natasha and find the person that you put on this pedestal and find out that after 50 years, she does still care about you and to be back in each other's lives, that entirely flips it from failure to success, right? Because that's just actually a beautiful human interest story of how people can help each other, overcome huge things and life and death situations, but ultimately a story of friendship. And that story of friendship that endures for over 50 years, despite language barriers, despite geography barriers, that is a story of success. And I think there has been a shift in her mind that actually her own story isn't one purely of failure, it's also one of success. And I can feel that sort of weight off her shoulders.
Has she considered going back, revisiting?
I think she wouldn't. I think, obviously, Russia is a very difficult place to go to right now for all of the reasons that we know. And I think my mum has still a lot of trauma and pain that's associated with it. Natasha is the beautiful, warm memory, but there is a lot of physical, emotional, and mental pain that she still associates with Russia. And I think it would be hard for her to go back, not just for the logical reasons of, okay, actually Russia, and Putin and all of the awful things that are happening means it's very hard to just go there as a Westerner. But I think actually, even if that wasn't the case and, Russia was to become a beautiful paradise tomorrow of freedom and democracy, I still think she would struggle to go because I think it's probably maybe a step too far for her now. Now, that's not to say that will always be the case in the future. But I think she wouldn't. I think it's such a negative, not Russian people, but the place of Russia in that time. It will always be 1974 to her there, even though it's 2025 now, right? So you should never say never, but I don't see it.
Have you visited? Do you ever plan to go to Russia?
You know what? I'd love to go to Russia. I find it a fascinating place culturally. The history, this vast expanse, it's very beautiful. I've always wanted to actually do the Trans-Siberian Railway. I'd love to. Again, a difficult place to go, not just for the logical reasons, but also through my company Message Heard, we have done quite a lot of work with Ukrainian media organizations like the Kyiv Independent. And not that I think we're very high on any list, but I think there probably is a black mark next to our name for people that bother to look. And it's probably a risk that's not worth taking at this stage, because we have proudly done a lot of work with the Kyiv Independent and Ukrainian organizations. So not looking to end up in a Russian jail anytime soon just for the sake of a holiday.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Going back to your mom's story, if you could track down and interview anyone else from her time there, who would it be?
There's probably a couple of answers to that. I think probably someone who was part of the medical facility or the medical team that was supposed to, I suppose, look after my mum when the authorities were alerted that, the little English girl's sick, what should we do? A decision was made to leave her in an isolation ward to, in effect, die, right? She got down to 6 stone. When she finally got back to the UK, the doctor examining her said, look, her organs were failing. A couple more days and she may well have died. I'd love to be able to speak to one of the Soviet medical professionals to understand what was the rhyme and reason to lock a young, frightened girl that didn't speak any Russian in a room and basically starve her. And that would be interesting to understand if there was any rhyme or reason to that from a medical perspective, or if it was just literally throw her in the room and throw away the key, lock her in there, and whatever happens. But also there was a huge failure there was a British consulate there where they were supposed to be checking in on her, and I don't think they ever once did, right? And that, I think, was a big sort of degradation of duty. It would have been interesting to understand what a British consulate, who was supposed to normally be looking after what is also, still a child, right, in Russia, and they never ever once looked in on her in the months and months that she was there. And I think, again, it would be interesting to understand why that was, if you could speak to someone that was there at the time. And I'm sure they're all dead now, right? It's 50 years ago. But those are two different perspectives of the same events that would also be interesting to fold into that story, because again, it's the same events through people that played very different roles, and we can't even guess what their rhyme and rationale for their actions were. So to have those two perspectives would be very interesting.
I want to talk a little bit about the production side, podcasts. Again, I'm a huge podcast listener, podcast producer. Now, they sound so seamless, but we all know that's a lie. It takes a lot of time, effort, energy. What was the biggest behind-the-scenes disaster you faced while making Finding Natasha? Was there anything that was like, not this, not now?
The strange thing about Finding Natasha is it was kind of never supposed to be a big, successful podcast, right? It was supposed to be a little tidbit of a story. I mean, originally it wasn't even going to be a podcast. It was just, can we do it? And then we were like, well, we should capture some of it in audio because, we're an audio production company and it could be a nice bit of marketing. And then it just kind of snowballed, right? And then it ended up becoming a hugely, hugely successful show with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of listeners, and Wondery licensing it, all of these great things. But it was not supposed to be that way. I'm glad it is, but it wasn't set out with that intention. So it's kind of a bit like everything that was hard to deal with or went off track. It was kind of a bit like, well, this is an experiment. This is going to happen. Things aren't going to go the way we planned. I think probably the biggest one is the fact that, when I first wanted to track down Natasha and I didn't know where to begin, I don't speak a lick of Russian. I don't really have any contacts there. I went to, a trusted source at the BBC, actually, who works in investigative things. And I said, look, if you were trying to find someone from Russia 50 years ago and you've got a name and a blurry photo, how would you do it? And they said, you've got to speak to this woman called Olga. Olga is a specialist people finder. We've worked with her before. If anyone can do it, it's Olga. So he introduced me to Olga. And, I thought this was going to be a long, drawn out, we take a left turn, it's a dead end, we go back. You can sort of see this beautiful kind of up and down, full of jeopardy story unfolding where we'll get there in the end. And, but you're going to fall a few times along the way. And
that was my expectation. When the story started, that was my expectation, that it would take a few
turns
twists
of the wheel.
And turns.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, that's kind of everyone is, and maybe that's an overly Hollywood interpretation because we're used to seeing that in story devices that, we usually consume. And, after one call with Olga where I explained the story and said what we're trying to do, and she was like, this is amazing. Of course I will, let me try and help. I think genuinely 48 hours later, she rang me and in that very sort of matter-of-fact Russian way just said, I found her. And I was just like, oh, well, we've kind of been looking for 50 years. She's like, no, I found her. And I was like, oh, okay, I feel shame right now. But then also I was like, look, I'm not a specialist people finder. I don't speak Russian. And, this is her core competency. But we just lent into it, like we kind of said at the beginning, rather than pretend and draw it into something that it wasn't. We kind of made a joke of it, right? That's why we're lucky we had Olga involved. She found her in 48 hours what we couldn't find in 48 years. But when that happened, and I remember me talking with my team when we were making it, we were a bit like, that's kind of ruined a lot of the storytelling that we thought we were going to do in terms of doing a multi-part narrative.
But it didn't. That's the interesting thing about this podcast. It didn't.
I'm glad. Yeah. A lot of people have said that. And I think maybe because authenticity often shines through, and perhaps if we had tried to fudge it and lie, it would have been obvious. And then it would have been a less genuine, authentic and good product, right? And I think the fact that we did lean into it, the fact that, like I said, it wasn't supposed to be this big, beautiful production that set the world on fire in terms of listeners. It was supposed to be a small experimental thing. Maybe allowed us to make a more experimental decision by telling the truth, which paid dividends. But when we made that decision, we didn't know if it would or not. And I think, again, that probably just goes to reinforce that, again, truism. Actually, people can sniff authenticity, and you should always be authentic whenever you can be.
This podcast was essentially an investigation into your family's history, right? Did finding Natasha inspire you to preserve other aspects of your family's past in a different way? Not through podcast, but something else.
I actually learned a lot more about my family history making the podcast than I knew before, which was certainly a rewarding thing for me. I touched it briefly earlier. My grandfather, who was born István Gyulai, came to the UK as a child refugee fleeing the Holocaust. He was the only person that survived out of his family, right? Everyone else was murdered. I didn't know so much of my family's direct history because we talk about it in the podcast. After the war, when, my grandfather found out that his parents had been, and all of his extended family really had been murdered in Auschwitz, and his brother had actually died in Russia being forced to fight on the Eastern Front by the Russians. He basically had a choice to make, which was either end his own life, and this is the way that he saw it because he couldn't handle the pain, or to close that section of his life off, become, of course you'd be incredibly emotionally damaged, of course you would, but effectively to compartmentalize it and go, I must never speak of this again. I put it back in the box and we can never let Pandora out. And my grandfather, he anglicized his name from István Gyulai to Stephen Gale. He was very dark. He experienced a lot of prejudice. I don't know if racism is the right term, but he was much darker and more obviously European than a lot of people would be in that day. And I think he did experience a lot of negativity and prejudice in trying to get jobs and things like that. And I learned a lot about his personal struggles through losing his family and suddenly being in a foreign land and not speaking English and having to make something of himself and a life, and which then resulted in, the birth of my mother, my uncle, and then, another generation deeper, here I come and look like the most English man in the world with incredibly pale skin and freckles, and I look like I'm more Irish or Scottish, so it's interesting to think about how someone's family horse can be so radically altered by being in a different country, culture, just within 2 generations.
Has telling this story given you and your mom some closure?
I think my mom definitely, in terms of, the fact that we found Natasha and that they're in each other's lives is a very beautiful thing. And even outside of the podcast now, they email like every other day. It's very sweet, actually. Natasha has a young granddaughter who she said to my mom, I want her to learn English from you. And so I go round and I record my mum reading bedtime stories. We send them to them in Russia. So my mum, is reading English bedtime stories to Natasha's granddaughter. And, it's a sort of intergenerational, beautiful story now where they will be in each other's lives forever, despite language barriers, despite geographical barriers, despite, all of the awfulness that's going on in the world. That is a beautiful story of finding someone again, right? It's proper love, not in a romantic sense, but it's really beautiful to see. I think the big thing for my mum was when she saved her, did she ever face any negative recriminations for the act of saving her? And I think that's a heavy burden to weigh for a long time if you think that my life was effectively saved by someone else who may have been punished for that, and I can never thank them because I don't know where they are, and I don't know if they're alive, and I don't know what happened to them. The fact that actually Natasha is fine and has had a good life means that my mum can go, okay, I'm not the cause of someone else's pain. So yes, absolutely, a lot of closure from that. And, I think, I don't know if I'd call it closure, but for me, I'm to understand and learn more about your own family's history, even if it is a story of pain and trauma, to me is always a net positive thing because, especially the older you get, the more wistful you are about where you come from and why you are the way you are and who are your ancestors and who are your grandparents and your great-grandparents. Understanding their stories and their struggles informs who you are, right, on a genetic level. So there is a lot of closure to this story as well.
Do you think everyone has a Natasha in their life, someone they should seek out for closure?
Probably is the answer.
So how do they go about doing that?
It's a good question. And I think it's one that requires introspection, right? Because you have to be able to take a minute and think outside of yourself, who should I be thankful for? Even if it's a small thing that led to a chain reaction of small things that resulted in a big thing, who has always been there for me or who has done, it doesn't always have to be some grand gesture, right? Where someone's run through machine guns and bombs in order to, save you from terrorists or whatever it is. It can be a small thing because a small action can have big ripple effects. And I think if we're being really honest, every single one of us in our lives can think back to just one act of kindness or an unselfish act which we experience the net benefit of. And so no one's life is all rainbows and roses, right? Everyone has their struggles. And usually there's at least one person that we can be thankful for. And sometimes, even if it's not a great journey to be able to track them down and be reunited in this great, grandiose way, but actually it's important to give people their flowers whilst they're still here, right?
Jake, has this story made you more aware and intentional about how you show up in this world and how you interact with folks? So if in years from now, someone were to track you down, they would discover something that you would want them to discover about you.
maybe I need to do that introspection, right? Maybe I need to think about actually, how can I be as kind as Natasha was that day? And I think it's definitely opened my eyes in order to be intentionally kind, because you never know the ramifications of what that kindness can lead to, even if there's nothing in it for you, right? That's the true definition of kindness, right? You're not doing it for any sort of reward. I think there's a big...
It's not transactional.
Exactly. I would like to think in many years from now, maybe someone will track me down and say, hey, you did this one thing and you thought nothing of it. And actually there was this great big ripple effect. And guess what? You saved the world. That would be nice. It's definitely made me approach not just my life, but certainly my professional life as well, in terms of journalism and storytelling, with more intentionality.
So what kind of story would you want to tell next?
I don't know if you've listened to it. We have a second season of Finding out. So after Finding Natasha, quite recently, the back end of last year, we released Finding Andy, because Finding Natasha was such a runaway success. Finding Andy, which I would highly recommend listening to, to you and your listeners if you liked Finding Natasha, where basically we kind of thought, well, look what we managed to do for my mum and my family. Imagine what we could do for others. We've got a bit of a platform now. It's resonated with people. How can we reunite people that need to find someone to thank them, to release that burden, that weight from their shoulders in the way that my mum needs to do it? And with Finding Andy, it was the story of a young guy called Loti who had come to England as a refugee from Angola and Congo, was his family heritage. And without ruining the story too much, he, a few years ago, ended up having a mental health crisis on a bridge in Manchester up north in England, and willing himself to end his own life and jump off this bridge. It was a bitterly cold winter's day, and it gets very cold in Manchester. And this guy with his young son and dog was walking past, and rather than just walk on, he sent his kid and his dog on their way. And he just said the right things to him at the right moment. Your life is worth living. He didn't say, hey, get down for that. He just talked to him on his level as a human being, and basically talked him down off this bridge and saved his life. It's got me realizing that there's no celebrities involved in these stories. These are normal people that need to find people to thank them. And I want to do more of it, because it's, for me, the most rewarding journalism, if you can even call it that. I suppose it is, but it's the most rewarding journalism I've ever done.
It absolutely is.
This episode is brought to you by Nerds Gummy Clusters, the sweet treat that always elevates the vibe. With a sweet gummy surrounded with tangy, crunchy nerds, every bite of Nerds Gummy Clusters brings you a whole new world of flavor. Whether it's game night, on the way to a concert, or kicking back with your crew, unleash your senses with Nerds Gummy Clusters.
In the end, Jake, I ask my guests to define the United States of America in a word or a sentence. As a journalist, a storyteller, as somebody looking at the US from the outside, how would you define it?
That's a difficult question. 3 weeks into Trump's second term of office, that's really depends when this is going out as well. You know what? There's part of me sort of feels, if I'm being brutally honest, that I'm not qualified to be able to sort of wag my finger and say, this is where America is going wrong and this is what America needs to do better, because I'm not an American and I don't have that lived experience of being in America, and I don't know what it's like, right? I've visited America. I have a sense of America. America is the prevailing culture for us in the UK, right? We have that expression, America sneezes and we catch a cold, which I think is very true. But I think America, for me, is a beautiful idea and a beautiful project that's lost its way somewhat. Because how can you have such extreme disparity between wealth and what is supposedly a people united by a set of values, a codified constitution of, the pursuit of life, health, happiness, all of these things. it doesn't feel that in actuality that's the reality. I think that there is actually a really interesting, I've always liked it, there's like an old Italian immigrant saying about America, which was, I came to America because they told me that the streets here were paved with gold. And I turned up and the streets aren't paved at all. And the worst thing is, I'm the one who's expected to pave them. And I think that's probably still true a little bit today for America. America is still this place that's on a pedestal. It's an ideal, it's a dream, the American way of life to most people around the world. But when you get there, the reality perhaps doesn't fit the dream.
I love it. And I love the way you've described it. And to your point, I understand why you would be cautious in defining America. But Jake, to be honest, all of us do it to other countries. We've not lived in those countries. We haven't experienced the culture, the nuances, the everyday living, and yet we judge them. So why not judge the US?
True, but it's the problem in my mind, at least, and a lot of people will tell me that I'm wrong, is that America is a continent. I don't even think it's too big to be a country. It's not just one homogenous culture, right? It's so many different peoples and cultures, and it's very hard to have a catch-all way of governing that represents all of those people. And if you're all things to all men, you end up standing for nothing.
Thank you so much, Jake. This was so good, and I can't wait to listen to Finding Andy. That's going to be my next podcast listen. Where can people find Finding Natasha, Finding Andy, and if there are any other podcasts you want to give a shout out to?
Yeah, well, I run a UK-based podcast company called Message Heard. We make a whole suite of shows, right, across almost every different genre, format imaginable. Sort of intentional storytelling is definitely at the heart of what we do. Our kind of strapline is podcasting with purpose, and we really take that to heart. So, look at any Message Heard show, and I'm sure there'll be something there for you, across whatever you're interested in. With Finding Andy and Finding Natasha, it's a combination of both being able to, listen to them wherever you get your podcast, right, to use that kind of phrase, but also through the success of those shows, or through the success of Finding Natasha, we actually signed a licensing deal with Wondery, which allows us to lean into their huge audience of diverted podcast lovers. It means we get the marketing might and access to that audience, right? So it's great. Wondery don't get to tell me what to do, but I do get to reach all their audiences. So you can also listen via Wondery, ad-free, all of those kind of things. What they're giving us an opportunity is to take Finding Natasha's success and turn it into a repeatable finding format where hopefully over the coming years we can tell a lot more people's amazing stories and reunite them. Fingers crossed.
Thank you so much, Jake. This was wonderful. Okay, so I am going to listen to Finding Andy. I did not know it existed, but now I can't wait to jump right in. If you haven't listened to Finding Natasha, do check it out. It's a great story of human spirit, connectivity, again, themes of love, faith, and unwavering human spirit. This episode was produced and written by me, Sadia Khan. The editorial review is done by Shay Yu. Our sound designer and editor is Lou Raskin. Theme music for Immigrantly is done by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Come back next week when I have another story for you. Oh, and by the way, did you check out our latest podcast, Lovely, which is all about dating, relationships, and the messiness in between. Take care and see you next time.